Evan. Right. Okay, so shall we reopen? Okay, welcome back. It's starting just a little bit late now, but welcome to day 2 of the GSSB meeting. We have the next item on our agenda is the final one for this public meeting, and this is the discussion of the GSSB work program for 2018 to 2019. And Bastian is going to talk us through this. These are items 12, 13, and 14 in your packets, and we will be looking to approve this revised work program as a result of this discussion. Is there any questions or commentary about the agenda item this morning? Okay. Bastian, please help us with this.
Thank you, Judy. So what this session is focusing on is the feedback received as well as any input that the GSB wants to give to the final work program, revised work program. And as Judy said, we're aiming to approve this today. We have, as per due process, asked the GRI governance body, specifically the board and the SC, to submit their comments on the revised work program. We have received comments from the Stakeholder Council. This is item 13. And we have also, as per due process, put the work program online for consultation. And we have received one public comment. And I think I should note that this is somewhat unfortunate outcome, I think. We will look into ways of publicizing this even more widely, but it has been publicized to the same extent we publicize other public consultation opportunities. We have also engaged some stakeholders specifically that had contacted us to inquire about the work program, to notify them of the fact that now there is an opportunity to comment on it. Let me start with the Stakeholder Council feedback for your consideration. I think I will summarize it. You had the document item 13 for review. On a high level, the SC agreed with the priority work areas, and I think that's important feedback. But they suggested that going forward, there should be included in the work program or documented in the process some explanation on why certain things have been prioritized. I think that's the one feedback I would single out on the actual elements of the priority work programs. Something that we might want to consider, whether this is part of a work program that you post that is rather uncommon, but we could maybe document the discussions that led to certain priorities in the work program in greater detail in the meeting minutes or in the documents that we send for the SC review. The SC is also highlighting the importance of sector work, and I think that's reflected also in my commentary yesterday when we had the session on the sector program. The SC continues to believe that this is an important gap in the overall context. And I think there's one commentary that then I should point out in addition that cuts through both the sector piece as well as other work areas suggested, and that is geared specifically towards the IRSC framework and the use of the capitals and to what extent there should be work in terms of explaining how the GI standards can be used in conjunction with that capital concept. And that was pointed out by the SC both in relation to the sector supplements as well as work area for consideration. For us, and we will come to that in a moment, that would fall under work with others on harmonizing, basically, or explaining the interrelation of efforts. A last point by the SC was that we could be more specific about the timelines provided in the work program itself. And I would go back to that notion that we should have maybe provided additional information that goes with the work program. Since the work program is for 3 years and is a static document for a year, it doesn't make much sense to project schedule specifically in it. But we have the project schedules available on the website at all times, and they're adjusted based on decisions of the GSB, and maybe we should have bundled this up in a better way when this was sent to the SC. Shall we collect feedback on the SC feedback specifically now, and we will bring that back later to the work program.
Okay, any sort of discussion around the comments received from the Stakeholder Council? Zulema.
When I started to work with the IIRC framework, for me it was very difficult to understand the concepts behind the capitals. So it's been the same with clients, where they can support their report on IIRC by fully understanding of what this capital approach does mean. So if you are following the suggestion, maybe it might be the opportunity to help to conceptualize this approach on capitals, because for me it's very fuzzy. It's not a concise metrics to follow. So I would recommend to start by defining a common understanding what would be each capital, and then to fit in our work, or to. I have a problem with this word harmonization, but alignment, it would fit better in my opinion.
I've got Michelle and Dwight and Kirsten.
Oh, for me, it's very fast, is that I think the jury is still out on, do you need 6 capitals like the IRC? Do you need economic, social, and environmental like the GRI does it? SASB is using 5. Robeco-Sam is using 7. They split the social capital into customers and others. And so I think it may be a little early to push on that. The second thing is that, well, we use the elements of contents and principles of integrated reporting. We don't use the framework, which is not mandatory by the IIRC. And we see more and more companies doing that. And the very few that I saw that were using the framework, it was a nice double page in the beginning of the annual report where they were listing indicators for each of the 6 capitals, and nowhere else in the annual report would these indicators be mentioned again.
Some time ago, when the IIRC framework was being developed, my organization made comments on that. We were not impressed by the 5 capitals concept, and frankly, it's made up. It's not like there's something that is in the past that they drew upon, that they therefore had a body of knowledge and they brought it to bear in their own organization. This was developed, I don't think, without a particular amount of rigor and without a lot of other knowledge. It's just sort of made up stuff, and it doesn't really work well in the social area, and that's the problem. And so I'm not convinced that we would need to sort of indicate that, oh well, we too want to join this intellectual edifice and deal with it, because I don't think it's a particularly good edifice, and our cooperation should be based on a different world. Remember, this is a sort of abstraction of the real world, and I don't think it's a good model. It doesn't stand up to a lot of tests. It doesn't stand up, for instance, to many of the tests we would use in terms of the world of work. So, and it's not, it's very much simplifies what are the relationship between economic activity of a corporation and the world of people who work for a living and how that affects society. It's just not a good model.
I am a strong promoter of IIRC and the framework, but for me it's a philosophy. It's the basis for a reporting strategy. It's not a reporting framework. And I must admit, when I read this, I didn't understand what the advice from the Stakeholder Council was. Having said that, the approach that Sulema suggests, it gives much more relevance to me, and trying to explain IIRC and GRI against each other, that's much more relevant than the way I read the suggestion here.
Other discussion? Yes, Sulema.
Just adding a final comment. If we decide to follow this suggestion, because in principle I'm against as individual, because of this, it's not based on precise definitions and concepts. But if we decide as a group to follow this recommendation, we should take advantage to provide more, I don't know, knowledgeable concepts to those capitals, ideas.
Nankumar.
Yeah, I wrote a mail to IRC, and IRC very categorically said that reporting on capitals is not mandatory. It's an optional. So why are we going with the 6 capitals if it is not a mandatory requirement?
So, I mean, I think that's possibly Nankumar posing a question back to the Stakeholder Council by way of dialogue. It's not the most efficient dialogue doing it this way, but let's try to sort of capture the sentiments. Kirsten.
Because my clear understanding is that it's not mandatory to report on all the 6 capitals. That depends on what's material to the company to do on. So for a company like mine, it's absolutely material to report on all the 6 capitals. For a more simple company, it might be sufficient to report on 3 or 4.
Michel.
Very short point. I think that the main interest of their presentation of the 6 capitals is attracting attention on the fact that social capital is not just diversity and indicators like that, but that it goes beyond when they split it in social, human, and intellectual. They open the field for more indicators. My own opinion is that the SDG model will take more and more importance and the capitals models less and less, but it's personal opinion.
Dwight, are you back in the queue? Okay, Kirsten.
Yeah, just very short. My clear understanding is also that there is no requirement by IRC to use the names they use for the 6 capitals. It's about the concepts.
Well, maybe just to summarize that, on the specific point with the IRC, is there an interest that we put them on the list of organizations where we could explore narrative on how the standards relate to the IRC efforts, framework, and broader than that? because that doesn't exist, but not specifically on the capitals, or trying to respond to the feedback that we actually don't see anymore. We saw that in the early years of the IRC framework, where we don't have these type of inquiries anymore related to the capitals.
We do, so the Stakeholder Council has made mention of this, first of all, in the content of the sector contents that we're starting work on. And I think one thing that we can do is to sort of say, well, the scoping of the sector work will be undertaken imminently. I think there's some fundamental work to be done by this group in terms of sketching out what sector contents will consist of. And in the process of having that conversation, we can certainly take on board their thoughts here around the capitals and see what the fit might be at that point. But this is sort of to be revisited, I think. And then on the kind of general point where they've suggested that we look at ways to assist reporters in linking GRI standards to the multiple capitals model. I think we might have some initial feedback here around what that looks like, but this is possibly something to sort of flag for further dialogue with the Stakeholder Council to understand their views on this, and whether there's a way that we can demonstrate responsiveness to it while kind of upholding the sort of fundamental requirements of the standards as well. So we maybe sort of separate the two of those. Is there further summarization to be done on this, Bastian?
No.
Okay. Kirsten.
And we should actually have quite some material on that already through the leadership groups, or whatever it's called, on integrated reporting. There are 2 reports following that, as far as I can remember, and in particular the last one, I think, contains very good content.
Well, I think in terms of looking at the Stakeholder Council recommendations, this whole capital thing was in the context of sectorial work, and I just don't. I think we can certainly do things like identify the industries as they propose without dealing with the 6 capitals, and I just don't think that there is a place in GRI where we have adopted this notion of 6 capitals, and I think it would be difficult, if not impossible, for us to do so. It's. But I think that the recommendation of that is something we already want to do about the sector. So.
Maybe it's something also for us to take up in conversation with the network engagement team, or I'm not quite sure if that's the right place for it, actually, within the Secretariat team, in the sense that, the time was that we had these linkages documents between G4 and other reporting frameworks and so forth. Maybe that's a more fruitful place to pick up something. There's possibly more to be teased out in this discussion, I think. Julia, sorry.
It's okay. I think, to me, the 6 capitals piece, the real alignment is with the materiality aspect. So I don't think it has to be like this harmonization or whatever with SASB and others. I think that's a much larger effort, whereas with this, I think this is a smaller piece, maybe just something to add to the materiality as a reference. We put out our first value creation model, and I think there is value in addressing the 6 capitals, even if they're not all material. You can explain why not, or what aspects, or, I do think there's value in it from a materiality perspective.
I agree. We don't have to necessarily embrace the 6 capitals, conceptually in doing the sector work. I just had a question, and Bastian, I'm not sure if you covered this off in the opening remarks about prioritisation of work areas, where the Stakeholder Council's queried whether there's a process for identification of new topics. Are they wanting to make recommendations necessarily to the board about new topics or having some sort of mechanism? There's not a recommendation that comes with that, but they've just kind of posed the question of wanting to know more about the process, but I assume that's with a view to making suggestions about topics.
No, I think it's more with the view to understand why the things that are on the work program are on the work program. I think that's, which we right now cover in the project proposals. So for each individual project that you're approving, there is a motivation in the documentation and rationale. But this was my point about maybe we should have bundled this up slightly differently to make these cross-references. Question for the GSB maybe at this stage is only, should we be including, if we have a list of, let's say, standards review projects, should we be including the rationale in the work program? Or is that something that we link through the project pages where all of this information can be found?
We might also, it occurs to me, Bastian, that maybe one possible action item coming out of this is for me to confer with Carol Adams, the Stakeholder Council Chair. In fact, is that what's behind the request for understanding around the process of identifying topics, just to make sure we're not assuming inaccurately what they're looking for, and maybe to test the possibility of, in the future, should we present them together in a different way, or should we link them in a different way? Maybe have a couple of options to discuss with her, and we'll see what the best way is to get stakeholder council feedback on that, possibly.
Shall we move on to the public comment received? So as I said, there's one commentary received, and that relates to the update of the biodiversity related standard. And it is coming from the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Center. They've been quite active in looking at this issue of creating metrics for specific sectors related to biodiversity. And while I think the overall attention to that subject matter of, if you want to frame it in context of ecosystem services, natural capital, and then biodiversity, it is still there. At earlier discussions, the GSB had said that while it's on a list of considerations, it wasn't a priority when we reviewed it last time. But it is something we can consider in a moment when we look at the set of projects that we publicly want to communicate as things to look into or actually start. Yeah. Okay. Shall we then move through the work program itself? And this is item 12, and this is the document that you have already approved for public consultation in November. I will go through the main priority work areas and just outline what we're committed to already under the different areas, and then also pose specifically the question where there is additional detail that we should be writing into the work program to indicate activities that are happening under the priority work areas. So for the review of the standards on a regular basis, the development of additional topic-specific standards, as well as issuing authoritative interpretations and guidance, it is basically the list of standards projects that are underway and have been approved by you in various stages. We will be busy still with launching and moving through final approval with the DPOC, the Water and Occupational Health and Safety Standard, obviously. We have started this year really the project on tax and payments to governments with the technical committee meetings, and similarly the human rights related standards. Importantly for human rights, this project will span at least over 2 years, if not more. If you look at the overall scope that was given, it is not only a review of some of the more generic standards related to management approach, and looking at how concepts can be built in, but it will branch out eventually into very the review of very many individual topic standards, so that there is a longer time period given. And I think by summer we will know what the end date of that is, but I think it's safe to assume that it will go beyond 2019 for full completion of that project. Disclosures on waste, we are in the formation of the technical committee stage, trying to bring together experts, and you have approved an early consultation version of the project proposals for spills and leaks as well. And that we will revisit in the midsummer. Last year, a project on the economic category was approved, and I've updated you yesterday that this is the project that we currently have put on hold, because it's a portfolio project and it requires significant additional research, which we currently don't have, and we cannot execute that project.
Bastian, can I just jump in here and kind of, I'll just sort of flag this, and maybe we'll discuss it a bit later on. But I note that, so the waste and the spills and leaks work comes as a direct result of the water review. Because having revised the water standard, we find ourselves with orphaned content at the moment, and we have unusable standards for some of this content right now as a result of doing the water work. What that has done, and you know, having revised the water standard was absolutely the right thing to do. I think we all agree on that. But it would have possibly been helpful for us to have understood that was going to be a consequence of doing that work, or to have had the ability to identify that as a potential consequence. Because what it means is that we have, just going back to the question on biodiversity, that has been kind of on our list. It's been on our radar for a long time. If all the other sort of content needs to then drop to further places in the list because of a decision that we made about water, we are possibly sort of tying our hands with respect to moving forward in new content creation. This might be a longer discussion about our work program process, but I just wanted to flag it, and maybe we'll come back to it.
Yeah, and I think what we did flag at the outset of the water project that there would be probably often content with waste. What we didn't expect is the spills and leaks standard emerging from this. And importantly, I think also now going forward with the commitment to look at waste, for example, the material standard might be affected as well. So we have generally these knock-on effects that we probably didn't fully appreciate in terms of how much they will in itself determine, given our resources, the work portfolio that we're looking at. And just to add to that, I think yesterday in the presentation and the final approval moment of the occupational health and safety contents, Laura has flagged to us that there has been the recommendation of the project working group to look at customer health and safety as one of the contents that were actually not covered by the work that they have done, but are considered by experts to be a gap in our current offering, because a lot has happened in that space as well, and there's clearly a responsibility that is assigned to corporations in that area as well, which is not adequately reflected in our standards at the moment. Maybe just to add to that then, we basically, summarizing discussions we had recently with the GSB, there are 3 additional projects to explore, consider, not to approve at this stage or anything, but that could fall under those priority work areas. And we have earlier this year in the phone calls and the virtual meetings returned twice to that notion of a review of the guidance on report content definition. And I think at various stages over the last year, the GSB has acknowledged that more guidance would be helpful on materiality, on how to assist organizations with focused reporting. So that's one issue area. I did mention the customer health and safety as an outcome of the OHS work, and now we have also the feedback specifically on biodiversity. In conversations yesterday, there was also mentioning of data privacy as one of these issues that is becoming hard to avoid. And my question was, is that also something that we should be putting on that list here? I think we should also see that list in relation to budget requests that are to be put forward by the GSSB to GRI in terms of the overall work program. So currently, when you look at the immediate future, the next months, we have limited resources, but of course, with a certain commitment that you want to make in terms of projects to cover, there is possibility to attach a funding request for additional projects, of course. But maybe to say, are these three subjects reflective of discussions related to new projects that to be considered or additional projects to be considered? Are there other things that we should be putting on this list?
Yes, again, two very fast comments. The first one, biodiversity, I can confirm that for us in the questions we get, it's as hot as human rights was last year. So if last year was the year of human rights, really this year is the year of questions on biodiversity. On waste, my feeling is that it's going to be far less complicated to update the waste standard than what it was for health and safety and for water, which are really two big ones, I mean to say. So I don't expect as much work on waste as on the other ones.
What I'm about to say isn't going to change anything that's written here, but it's sort of to put a marker down. The human rights work begins with the committee that has been created now, but it's anticipated that that committee would then make recommendations. And what is not known right now is the extent of the recommendations and the extent of the work that would be involved should all of those recommendations be followed through. And for instance, you know, we've looked at, say, the many labor indicators in the GRI standards, and I think it would be reasonable to expect that most of them would probably need to be revised in one way or another to be brought in line with the current thinking on human rights. But also, I think there will be other work, including the DMA approach and including several other areas within GRI that are not labor. So in planning the work for the period, I think we have to sort of recognize that this human rights stuff is going to, it may involve several committees, or it may involve the work of several committees in one way or the other. So that would be my comment on that. The other thing I wanted to say is, in terms of authoritative interpretations and guidance, I'm thinking maybe we, as a body, given the way the current state of play outside of GRI, we probably should consider coming up with an authoritative statement on what materiality means in non-financial reporting. As a statement of the body, a considered one, obviously. We'll have to develop this statement. But I actually think we should do that. And it's becoming clearer to me that, and I don't know how much work that would be, but I think it should be something we should do within the next year.
I think I was trying to reflect that in that first point here on the slide, that we keep coming back to that, and which shape or form it takes and what the specificity of that is, that's to be debated. But that notion comes back, I think, again and again in your discussions.
Yeah, and I was just suggesting the inclusion of data privacy as a potential project at the end of the list. It's a little early, but it is certainly gathering a lot of attention. You've got GDPR, a lot of companies working on the data privacy regulation. So as a long-term consideration, it might be worthy of adding to the list and just having that in the record as an issue that we have our eye on.
Bastian, to Dwight's point about the impact of what comes out of the current human rights projects, I mean, what we have right now is a technical committee that is essentially looking at recommendations to us as to what should then be changed about existing content in standards, creation of new standards, or what have you. So they're doing that first piece of work. I guess there's a question in my mind around when they make their recommendations, what do we need to be able to be in a position to do? And what ambition do we have to then say, great, thank you, technical committee. We now are going to set up this number of working groups to do this spread of work. It's a sort of, it again kind of comes back to the issue as to what happened with water, although a little bit more conceptual at this stage compared with the water knock-on effects. Will all of that work, the sort of further work on human rights related standards after this current phase, will all of that happen in the financial year following the one that we're in right now, and therefore we don't really, you know, I mean, we're not in a position to plan it anyhow? Or how can we gain a little bit more explicit clarity with respect to the likely workload that we want to be able to support, so that the board can kind of understand not just, you know, from, as Tim said this morning, you know, from one kind of project to the next and 1 year to the next, what the budget request is going to be, but a little bit more about the, you know, what's the ambition for us to be able to support this type of activity in the future?
Well, I think specifically for human rights, as the phase 2 is outlined, I think what we observed at the time is that it will likely affect a couple of the universal standards. For sure, the management approach, it could have implications in terms of the recommendations on defining report content and specifically materiality. Beyond that, there are more than 10 standards out of the current 33 that are just by definition affected because they are human rights related topic specific standards. Some could be superseded, others need review, and the one group that is for sure part of that is the one that Dwight has pointed to, the human rights related standards. And that in itself would be a very big project to take on. They're interrelated. It would probably the labor-related. That will be a portfolio project again. So the knock-on effects. I think it's too early, given that we don't have the recommendations yet, and we're just coming out of an in-person meeting to say what exactly the number of groups is that we're looking at. But what is relatively certain, I think, is that we have to stage the implications of these recommendations over several years. And I think that's what I was saying earlier. Will go beyond 2019. And I think in summer, when we have the recommendations of, we expect that around June, in a first form from the technical committee, that we can probably have a discussion about how we want to stage the follow-up of this and what is actually considered to be priority for the GSSB. Yeah, right now the range could be from, well, just to reflect on the main point of discussion also in the group right now, it's unclear whether we will have a recommendation from them to review all topic-specific standards. Some in the group lean towards not having topic-specific standards at all on human rights issues. Others go the other way and say, well, we need many more of those. And that in itself would result in very different work portfolios. It's too early to tell, I think, for that follow-up. But I acknowledge fully the point that this has even more repercussions than projects that we have committed earlier to. Yeah.
Kirsten.
I have no proposals to simplify the review on human rights, but I just wanted to assure that children's rights are included in the current review.
Right, and so explicitly in the project scope is our child labor related standard, which could then be at least part of that discussion. But it's not fully reflective of the discussion that you have under the UNICEF and other mandates at the moment.
Yeah, I'd like to respond. Yeah, the point is, I think, with this committee is that we have to look at the full range of human rights, including child rights, and to make sure that there's a way that they're dealt with. Now, there is this broader debate within the committee as to whether we have more topics or no topics and this and that would affect that consideration. But yes, I mean, child rights are understood as being part of the human rights discussion, and I think probably it won't get ignored.
Very good, because children's rights are so much more than child labor. And that's very important to understand.
Maybe can I make a suggestion maybe to how to move that specific discussion forward in context of the work program? What we could do in the work program is to single out those projects that have committed resources and are underway as of now, including the waste related update, and then have a list of subject matters, including spills and leaks, and then materiality or report content related work, customer health and safety, and biodiversity, as well as data privacy related the related area, and say these are things that will be revisited in due course, and maybe we can put a timeline to that and say that they will be revisited this year, because it is related to the implications of other projects, and B, I think also what the overall ambition level is, how many projects we can run in parallel, which is a resource question, but also as we've gone through just 2 reviews in parallel, now we have 4 or 5 underway, and how many more do we want to take on? And I think that's a discussion that is still pending. But for external stakeholders, it would give visibility of what's on the priority list, what's there for consideration, and to be decided on later in the year.
Okay. Anything else on this? Yeah, Robin.
Yeah, it's just something for the watch list. It sort of falls way down, and it may come out of the discussions with the TCFD. And it is more around the impact of organisations' response to climate adaptation. So when they do I think it's fairly clear where there's a strong alignment with GRI and TCFD on greenhouse gas emissions, footprinting, that sort of work. It's the implications of the scenario planning and the decisions that get made as a result of that could have and likely to have impacts on a broader group of stakeholders. And I think that's something that may emerge over the next few years in terms of a gap that standards like GRI are likely to fill. So companies, for example, that might respond to drought risk by buying up water rights, for example, that has impacts on a broader group of stakeholders in those sorts of communities. So I think some of those sorts of issues may come out of the TCFD discussion, or it may come out of some other areas, but it's a gap that I think will probably fall to GRI to look at rather than any other framework.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time to bring this one up, but I think continuing the discussion we had earlier about investor advisory council or some sort of group like that, I'd be happy to take it as a separate item with others that are interested in focusing on that.
There will be an item in a moment where we could bring that up again. Yes, I think on this, I think I have a way forward, and I will summarize just the action items then for us in review. For other priority work areas, the specific activities for developing sector-specific content, as we discussed yesterday, we will have discussions going forward on how the sector program should be rolled out, specifically in how a pilot could look like. And that will happen in the next months. I think the work program as such is already reflective of that. We have, in terms of participation in initiatives and projects to improve the quality of reporting, the main work that is done, and it is not very substantive, I think, at that stage, is that we facilitated GI's participation in the IAASB process that was mentioned in this meeting before. Other than that, there are no initiatives of the standards division, the GSB, underway at the moment that we're singling out here. That is everything we do. We have in the work program a reference to the CRD as well, but that's ongoing work, and there's more representation into that discussion on a technical level, but no substantive outcome, I think, of any kind to be expected with relevance to the GRI standards right now.
As the IAASB work unfolds, do you have a view, Bastian, about how this group can stay on top of the content of those conversations? And I mean, obviously, the GSSB is not part of that conversation, but how can we respond to it and participate in the way that's suitable to our work?
Yeah, the project has only just started in terms of engaging the level of a representation where GI is involved. The chair of the GI board, Eric Hespenheit. So I think that the natural follow-up to the first meetings they have would be to invite Eric to a meeting to report back on implications that he sees from that work. Okay. For the development of new guidance for specific groups of reporters, the suggestion here is right now to continue to monitor this. You've seen in the SC feedback, and I think that keeps coming back as reference for us, reference to SMEs. But as I mentioned yesterday in the update, we feel it's, given that we only have 400 GI standards reports and only a fraction of them are completed by SMEs, we just don't have the basis to come to a conclusion on whether or not the GI standards are fit for purpose for this particular group. And we would suggest that we keep monitoring that, and we can bring back over the next year the learnings from the SME-related engagements and programming that the GI Secretariat has overall to come to a conclusion whether there is additional guidance needed. As of now, we would have a very limited pool of experienced SME reporters that have used the standards to come to any kind of conclusion on that. Yeah. When it comes to collaboration with key partners, I think, and we had the ambition for this ongoing financial year to at least continue the work with CDP on the linkage documents. We didn't have a sufficient resource allocation to do that. We have partially addressed that through having worked very closely with CDP on the update on the water standard. But we believe, and we receive inquiries around that, that it would be helpful to continue to assist reporters to, in terms of explaining the relationship with the CDP in particular, simply because there is a very significant overlap between the two efforts, and we still see continued interest in using both GI standards and the CDP questionnaires. Related to that, also the TCFD follow-up that we have discussed at the last in-person meeting, we now hope to finally be able to work on that linkage piece that we have discussed. The next priority work area in the work program is to provide technical input on programs, products and services developed by GI, and I think we've seen now in recent weeks that there is really growing demand and need for the standards division to be involved in those reviews. We have always worked under the assumption that 10 to 15% of the time of the standards division goes to these processes. This is likely going to be more going forward. The exact scoping is still to be done, but we expect that we need to invest more in this nexus of making sure that the contents of the GRI standards are represented adequately in all the programs, products, and services that GRI is developing. And we don't want to stop doing the monitoring work, which has helped us greatly in the transition to standards. This has been put on the back burner, if not on hold, in the last year, but we are picking this up again now that we are through the launch of the GRI standards and the translation work. And we will look at a very focused engagement in the coming months, but hope towards the end of the year to start that again. And that's reflected here also in the work program. Importantly, also, we will continue the discussions whether we can work with third parties here. Yeah, I think that concludes the feedback that I have on the work program as it stands right now. Is it now time to take stock in terms of specific amendments to the work program that we want to note?
Why don't we do that?
Yeah? Okay. So, or shall we, are there any other
well, I'll just ask the question. Any questions or feedback on the last few points that Bastian has been making? Vincent, yeah.
I just wondering, Sebastian just pick up the point that some of the stakeholders feedback about the SMEs on the standards, and I just wondering, does the Stakeholders Council receive any feedback on the conglomerates? Since my experience in Asia, for the last few years, the growth of the conglomerate is much higher than the single sector. No, I just don't have time to review all the feedbacks from the stakeholders. So do they give any feedback on there's a need to develop a standards on the conglomerates?
I think what we see, I would place that under that sector program. The reality of the conglomerates, at least in the European context, has been that they start to identify very specifically which sectors that they're active in, and they orient their reporting in the specific sectors in relation to efforts that are underway for a sector. So one organization reporting on multiple sectors. Maybe there is an opportunity as part of the sector program to also provide guidance to conglomerates on how to address that reality, that they're active in a whole range of sectors and specific guidance in that respect. But a standard specific for conglomerates or has not been considered at any moment in the last years.
Well, and the Stakeholder Council specifically didn't raise conglomerates as I mean, they have raised SMEs as an example of specific groups of reporters. I'm sure they would not exclude conglomerates from that general point of feedback, but the way that we consider the needs will be quite different for that group versus the first group. Dwight.
Is there a need, for the purpose of the work plan, to elaborate on this part about technical input on programs and other activities? You know, presumably in the other side of the GRI structure. I mean, is this enough for this purpose?
Well, I think personally that in answer to your question, I think it would be very helpful for a number of reasons for us to have more specificity about what the expectations are there. That goes beyond the capability of this group today to make an amendment to our work program. However, I think we need to sort of put it on the agenda for having that wider conversation, creating some specificity, coming back to this group around, well, here's what the expectation now does look like, and here's how we will be able to commit to it over the course of the year.
And maybe we can make that an action point, not related to amendments to the work program as it stands, but an action item for one of the upcoming meetings to produce in collaboration with the GI Secretariat an overview of what specifically is requested. Yeah. And so if we can note that, and we will try to bring it in May, otherwise in June.
So then, the question of amendments to the work program for today's purposes.
Yeah, I think importantly, what I would note here is that we would induce more specificity on the project schedule that is already committed, reflecting the projects that are underway, as well as a list of projects that we have just reviewed a moment ago with the additions that were made for consideration. Clearly delineating that there is a decision that is pending and not a commitment yet to take on these projects at this stage. We will also look at specifying the work, I think, around the linkage documents a bit more than what we have in this work program, so the collaboration with key partners. I would want to propose that we are specific in relation to CDP and TCFD based on earlier discussions and today's input. We have a mentioning of the IRC already in the work program, and I think that's reflective also of the discussions today. So I wouldn't make it a specific action item here in terms of releasing a specific document. Noted the point about the technical input provided to the Secretariat. We will take that separately forward, but keep the specificity of that work program item right now. And yeah, I think that would conclude the actions based on this discussion for amendments to the revised work program.
One thing that occurs to me, and apologies for introducing this a little bit late in the conversation, but just very briefly, I know that we're aware from time to time of discussion and in some cases criticism around the area that is often referred to as context-based sustainability or science-based targets, these sorts of activities, which I think, you know, occasionally we have a challenge raised around GRI's sort of commitment to the sustainability context principle. Kind of the suggestion is that it's not actually apparent in the standards how you would go about doing that. I think what I'd like to say is that we are aware of this, and we're aware of the work that other organizations have attempted to get underway around this. It remains at a very early stage of emergence, you know, and so early that we don't have any comments externally, at least this time around, on the proposed work plan on this. But I think, you know, we would all probably share the commitment to keep monitoring that activity and see how it gets taken up in the reporters community. Michel.
I think there is a big difference between being a reporting standard, which means you define how to report, and entities like science-based targets, which are there to define if your target is a good one or not one, or a bad one. And I think it would be quite dangerous for GRI to move into also offering a judgment on values reported.
It is possible, I'll just say, that this comes up in the linkage efforts with CDP, for example, because I know that this is an issue for them in the way that they have sort of framed many of their approach. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, but well, CDP has changed mind practically every year on what was an adequate target to have. And in the past, it was on year-on-year performance. Now it's on, do you have science-based targets? It's not ready yet, I would say. It's not certainly not ready to become a standard.
Kirsten and Dwight.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Michel. And of course, GSSB should survey what is being out there. but we also have to have a critical sense when doing it. In my opinion, science-based targets, that's more a trademark than it's science-based. And also, as Michel says, CDP is changing quite often in their approach. And it would become extremely complicated if we should follow up on that on a continuous basis. We have to be upfront, we have to be to update it, but it must be on a rationale, not based on changes in one or another initiative.
One way of bringing it back into the work program would be to mention it under the emerging reporting practice that we want to monitor. And we can give that a specific mention so that it is noted in public that this development is monitored, but it is not in relation to setting standards, to Michel's point. Yeah. That is, we're not originating a new project or anything like that, but we're reflecting on that development at stages over the next years.
And just a brief comment. In terms of the problem of sustainability context, I think it's something that works much better in the environmental area than it does in the social area. And so we might want to, at one point, look into that problem.
It's absolutely, I couldn't agree more with you about that. And it clearly remains, a fairly niche practice at the moment. That's not to say that it isn't robust in its own way, and that we can't learn anything from it. It's just that this is very much emerging. Okay, so sorry, that was a little bit of a detour, but let's go back to the revisions to the work program.
Yeah, I think I've concluded on all the things that I would bring back into the item 12 that is in front of you. And the process that I would propose is that we approve the work program with the discussed amendments, and that the chair will then review the amendments, and this will go online.
Sorry, I did just want to add one thing about the science-based target and context-based. Sure. And certainly the notion that while the GRI standards ask for target setting, that we're pretty hands-off about what that methodology might look like, but we'll monitor that. I think we do need to be public about monitoring discussions around context-based reporting, because sustainability context is still a key reporting principle in terms of content determinations in the standards currently. So keeping abreast of how that's playing out and the relationship between that agenda and our own content determination principles would be something worth tracking.
So we will include a specific mentioning under the carry-out monitoring on the use of the GI standards and emerging reporting practice, and we can refer to that development as one that the GSB will be monitoring. Yeah.
Right, so then before we do this, I'm just going to check in with Kent Swift down the line and make sure that we haven't missed an opportunity to engage you on any thoughts regarding the work program.
No, I have enjoyed the discussion. The one thing that keeps coming back to mind, and I'll just bring it up here, but I don't think we should add it to the work plan, is that Tim was talking about the need to sort of streamline, or people think that the standards are, there's just so much involved in reporting. And yet, as we come out with each new standard, or as we revise these standards, we're increasing the reporting. And I think at some point, it's just sort of a general discussion needs to take place about, we're making better reporting because we've learned things, say in water, about how to tell people what to report. But on the other side to it is, that the revised standard has quite a bit more to it than the old one. And I just have this concern that it's somehow conflicting with Tim's concern about the whole reporting standard being too complicated.
Could we perhaps make a mention of complexity and reporting burden as part of the monitoring as well? If we perhaps add that to the
Yes, absolutely. I think that we follow up suggestions for engagement, and it is part of that collaboration element, and we can bring that back. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so what we need to do is to approve this revised work program. As you know, this is an ongoing project, so we revise it periodically and approve each revision in turn to be published on the GSSB website. This is not subject to the same sort of due process formalities as we went through yesterday with the standards revisions, and therefore we can treat this as one of the kind of normal GSSB decisions that we do on a regular basis. We have, assuming there are no further questions, comments, concerns at this point, to bring forward the revised GSSB work program subject to the agreed modifications that we've just been discussing here. I will review those on your behalf if you're happy with that, and that will sort of go, you will obviously see the results of that. But subject to that being done, I would like to ask if there are any objections or abstentions to this decision to approve the revised GSSB work program. Hearing none, I will, that indicates that this has passed then and will be published on the GSSB website when it's in its final form. Okay? And when is the next sort of formal moment for us to review it, or is that entirely up to us to determine?
This should be happening on a yearly basis. I think it is interesting also in terms of the governance review how practical that really is, because basically on a yearly basis would mean that we table it for you in June again, probably, to come to approval moment in September.
Right.
And how frequent that really needs to be. There is an interesting interrelation, I think, between the work program and the budget request, which we will have to discuss in more detail, because we could also look at what is set out now in this document and attach the budget request with more of than 1 year window to it.
And I think maybe one piece of context around that is that the GRI board has one of the sort of administrative things that has recently happened is that the financial year for GRI has now been revised to correspond to the calendar year, which actually means for the next financial year we really ought to be putting together the specific budget requests around the work program right about now. But again, we have the governance review that is in the midst of happening right now. I think that means watch this space, actually. What I'll intend to do is to see to what extent we can kind of table this for the next GRI board meeting as part of our update to the board, sort of report on our progress and so forth. The questions that we have for them will include issues such as, how do we make sure that we get the specific budget requests, kind of aired appropriately and made transparent for the board in the right kind of time frame to act on it. Anything else on this? No? If I'm not mistaken, that means that we have concluded this item on the agenda, yeah? Which means that we have come to the end of the agenda for the public meeting for this two-day meeting of the GSSB, half an hour earlier than anticipated. Unless there is any public AOB to be added at this point or points to be raised, I think what we want to do is, first of all, to acknowledge our colleague Kent Swift, who is, I hope, going back to bed soon, and thank him for being on the phone. Acknowledge all of you and your efforts to be here with us over the course of these 2 days and to engage with all of this content in detail. I'm very pleased with the work that we have done over the course of the last 2 days to bring to conclusion a number of our work streams that will now be able to be used by reporters and to contribute to the ever-growing body of the standards contents. We will have our next regular virtual meeting in May, yeah? We do not have one later on this month. So our next regular virtual meeting will be in May, and we have committed to a number of action items over the course of yesterday and today that will be under discussion then. We will be in touch with the specific timing around your contributions to the forthcoming agenda for the May meeting, but that is normally you have up until about 2 weeks before the meeting to raise those, but it would be given the urgency of some of the timing that we need to respond to, I would really encourage you to be thinking rather sooner about any additional agenda items to be added to the May meeting. Apart from that, I think thank you to anyone who may be listening down the line, and the record of this meeting will be adopted at the May meeting, but then will be made public on the GSSB website thereafter. Thank you very much, and this concludes the public meeting.